Okay. Well, good morning, and thank you for braving the cold here. And it's a January cold, even it's only December. Welcome to today's Edward and Helen Hintz Book Forum. We'll be discussing Mark Clifford's wonderful new biography of Jimmy Lai, the former publisher of Hong Kong's Next magazine and the newspaper Apple Daily. Jimmy's now sitting in solitary confinement in a Hong Kong jail and is being punished for his effort to promote democracy and basic freedoms there. Mark's book is aptly titled The Troublemaker: How Jimmy Lai Became a Billionaire, Hong Kong's Greatest Dissident, and China's Most Feared Critic. And I might say not only China's most feared critic and Hong Kong's greatest dissident, he may be globally the most renowned dissident we have today. Now, before introducing Mark, I should note, in case you haven't already figured it out by the absence of hair, I'm not Robert Doar, AEI's president. Robert, unfortunately, was caught in the snowstorm last evening, and his flight didn't make it out of Albany, so I'm standing in for him. And I'm Gary Schmidt. I'm a senior scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I have the great honor of having known Jimmy for a quarter of a century. Now, I'm going to introduce Mark. Mark is a veteran journalist who's worked mostly in Asia, including serving as the editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post, and then the publisher and editor-in-chief of Hong Kong's The Standard. Mark has a PhD in history from the University of Hong Kong and is the author of Today, Hong Kong, Tomorrow, the World: What China's Crackdown Reveals About Its Plans to End Freedom Everywhere. Mark is currently the president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Our format today will be pretty simple. Mark's going to start us off with discussion, 12 minutes. He has a slideshow that he'll be showing. And then Mark and I will have a back and forth, and then we'll take questions the last half of our session. So, Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Gary. Thanks to everyone at the American Enterprise Institute. Delighted to be here. And as Gary said, I'm going to start off with just a quick slideshow. Can I ask, how many of you have been to Hong Kong? Yeah, most of you, as I figured. But this is just a reminder to visually situate you and situate Jimmy as we talk a little bit about his extraordinary life. So this is Jimmy and his mother and twin sister CY, and another sister who's a couple years older at obviously a very young age. He's born just over the border from Hong Kong and on the outskirts of Guangzhou. A couple years later, his mother was in and out of labor camps, and CY and Jimmy were left to fend for their own, take care of their disabled sister. At the age of 6, he started hustling on the street. This is the world Jimmy was born in. This is just before he went to Hong Kong at the age of 12. This is a reminder of what Hong Kong looked like when Jimmy moved there. People were sleeping on the streets. People were living in shanties like this. He first went to his aunt and uncle's house. It was so small he couldn't even sleep on the floor. He spent the first night in a factory, a glove factory, where he started working. 15 years later, he owned a factory. He probably looked very much like this, quickly became one of the biggest sweater manufacturers in China, if not in Asia. And Hong Kong moved on from the people sleeping on the streets to this kind of little level of prosperity by the late 70s, early 80s, when, again, Jimmy became one of the biggest sweater manufacturers around. Then he got into retail. He started the Giordano retailing shop. He became the father of fast fashion. I'm sure many of you know Uniqlo, the Japanese retailer. Tadashi Yanai, the founder, came down to learn at Jimmy's knee, and I wouldn't say worship Jimmy, but he learned a lot from Jimmy. So it's interesting to see what he started. Then Jimmy was not political, but Tiananmen well, he was so optimistic about economic reforms, and he was so hopeful about what the students were doing in '89. This photo is of Chai Ling, Wu Kaisha, and Wang Dan, 3 student leaders. Jimmy made T-shirts featuring each of them, sold them at the Giordano shops, and sent the proceeds to up to the students in Beijing, along with tents and other material. Obviously, things ended badly. Jimmy, rather than retreating, decided he'd go into media. He started Apple Daily, first Next magazine in 1990, Apple Daily in 95. I first met him in 93, and he told me about his crazy plans to start a newspaper. Anyway, I was wrong. He was right. It became an overnight success. There's Chris Patton, last governor of Hong Kong. Martin Lee, reading Apple Daily. And you can see these beautiful, big, bold use of color, graphics, color printing. He was the first guy to bring color to Hong Kong newspapers. Of course, everybody knew 1997 was coming. Apple and Next kept fighting. This is 2003 when 500,000 people came out in the streets against Article 23 national security legislation. That's cover of Next magazine, blown up to be a poster. That is Tung Chee-hwa, the first chief executive of Hong Kong, with a pie smashed in his face. He was not amused, apparently. But this was a real turning point for Apple and Next, because it was Jimmy and the media group that rallied people and got 500,000 people out on the street, an unprecedented post-1997 display of political activism on Hong Kong's part. This is what the street looked like that day, very peaceful, but not a lot of traffic moving. Fast forward to 2014 and the umbrella movement, 79 days of occupying Central. Jimmy was out there every day, not at night. He didn't sleep there, but he was out there every single day, 79 days, is sitting in front of a tent, accessible, talking to people, but not a leader. And this is also important. Jimmy is not a political leader. But for his pains, he got pig guts dumped all over him, got harassed here as in many other places. That's also 2014. Jimmy, it's interesting, he had been a behind-the-scenes media guy. You wouldn't see him speaking at public events, but he really wanted to support the students, not from a leading role, but to bear witness. And obviously, he didn't just have pig guts dumped on him. That's tear gas. Here he is with his wife, Teresa. This is 2017. I was with them. We were in New Orleans. Teresa has been a major stabilizing force in his life. His first marriage did not end well, and Teresa, again, has been a real anchor and led him to embrace Catholicism. He converted just after the handover in '97. Here he is in 2019. You can see he is taking a more active role. 2020, just after the national security law came into effect, the first time he was handcuffed. He'd been arrested before, but police came to his house about 6 weeks after the national security law came into effect, handcuffed him. At the same time, and I was on the board of directors, 250 police marched into our headquarters. Sorry, this is jumping around a little bit. This is Jimmy being arrested in 2019. This is the backdrop, I guess, to the incredible uprising that led the government to arrest Jimmy. This is Jimmy with John Lewis and Martin Lee. The cover to my book, in a way, reflects John Lewis's admonition to make good trouble. And Jimmy and Martin met by chance. John Lewis, when they were here in 2019, and Jimmy asked John Lewis to make a video imploring the students of Hong Kong to remain nonviolent. And so it's so ironic that he's now being held up as somebody who's trying to undermine Hong Kong, when I think he's a great patriot. Sorry, these slides are a bit out of order. So we're back to the raid. They're raiding Apple Daily. They're carting stuff away. It's Jimmy being perp walked. Jimmy being taken away. Jimmy getting out. One of the last times he's out. So this is now. I think we're back to December 2020. He is being transported around obviously in custody. Last day of Apple Daily, the government, and again, I was on the board, the government, John Lee, now the chief executive, froze our bank accounts, which meant although we had plenty of cash, we couldn't pay our staff, we couldn't pay our electricity bill, we couldn't pay the phones, we couldn't do anything, couldn't take credit card payments from our 600,000 digital subscribers, put out of business. There's the last known photo of Jimmy, taken, kind of a samizdat photo taken by AP photographer, long lens, way up on a hill above Stanley Prison. For her pains, this photographer has now been denied entry to Hong Kong. I don't know, for some reason the government doesn't even want a picture of Jimmy. He is being held in solitary confinement. That's where he's been for most of the last 1,400 plus days. This picture shows him going out to exercise. He gets about 50 minutes of exercise a day. He's got no window in his cell. There's, not surprisingly, no air conditioning, although it gets extremely hot in Hong Kong in the summer. Just a couple of pictures. These are some of the things that our organization has done to try to keep a spotlight on Jimmy and on other Hong Kong political prisoners. We have to remember more than 1,900 people have been imprisoned on political charges in Hong Kong in the last 5 years. So this is the Guggenheim Museum, also the Guggenheim. That's actually Department of Energy. You see the Capitol in the background. This is London, Tower Bridge. That's Teresa with their daughter Claire, and in the back, their son Augustin going to court. Teresa's at court every time Jimmy is in court. And today was the 100th day of Jimmy's trial, and he's taken the stand in his own defense. There's just a lovely photo of Jimmy. Painting in the background is by Wallace Ting, a friend of his and somebody that Jimmy studied art with, a great artist. Jimmy spends a lot of his time in prison drawing religious subjects. So there we have it. So thank you.
I think one of the great things about the book is the interface, the interconnection between Jimmy's life and Hong Kong over the years, and I think the slide presentation sort of captures that. But I want to talk first a little bit more about Jimmy. So there's a number of, in the book, but also from personal knowledge about Jimmy, there are these seminal moments in his life that sort of seemed to form, what the man he became. So one of which is just simply that early incidents, or not early incidents, one of his first jobs when he got into Hong Kong was he wasn't in Hong Kong yet. He was at the border with Hong Kong, Guangzhou, where he became a porter. Can you talk a little bit about what the...
Yeah, sure. So as I said, he's basically been hustling on the streets since he was 6 years old. I mean, he always says his mother went to a labor camp. In technical terms, it doesn't seem to have been a labor camp because she could come home on weekends. And so neighbors would sort of take care of Jimmy and CY and the sister who was 2 years older. But they were hustling. He was doing black market activities of various sorts. He was selling metal, scrap metal, when it was being melted down for the Great Leap Forward, which was, of course, a total disaster. And one of his jobs was being a porter at the Guangzhou railroad station. And one day, a guy came, he carried the guy's luggage. The guy gave him a tip, gave him a little money, and then about to turn away and reached into his pocket, gave him a half-eaten chocolate bar. Jimmy was hungry. You've got to remember, this is the Great Leap Forward. Something like 45 million people died in the worst man-made political famine ever. Jimmy's this skinny, scrawny, hungry kid. He's so happy when he can catch a field mouse and grill it. This was a real delicacy. So this guy gives him a piece of chocolate, but he feels a little furtive, a little embarrassed, and so he turns around and he has a little bite of it, and he's like, wow, his head explodes. And he turns to the guy and goes, what is this? He says, it's chocolate. He goes, where are you from? Hong Kong. Wow, I'm going to Hong Kong, land of chocolate. So for a year, he begged his mother. It was interesting because he was on his own, but obviously he's very, very close to his mother. She lived well into her 90s, and they were very, very close. He got her out of China, and she finally let him go. A funny story because. He managed to get a one-way permit because he helped an official keep an eye on the guy's girlfriend who lived in an adjacent apartment. So he gets a one-way permit to Macau. So he gets to Macau, he leaves China legally, gets to Macau legally, and then stows away on a boat to Hong Kong. People are throwing up all night. There are people crammed in this boat. You got to remember, he's a stowaway. There are more than 1 million people. The city is being overrun by refugees trying to escape Mao. And he gets to Hong Kong and starts working in this glove factory. And so he's forged in the kind of fires that I think you and I just can't imagine. And so, he's 12 years old. I mean, how many 12-year-olds didn't make it? His sister ended up swimming, and her companion, they had some kind of inflatable, but her companion almost died. I mean, lots and lots of people died on that crossing. And then once you get to Hong Kong, you're in a shanty town. There are fires. There's typhoid. There's, tuberculosis is rampant. And so not only to survive, but to thrive makes him, 1 in 1,000, one in.
Yeah, what's striking about it is the hustling almost from day one. I mean, if there was a sort of a natural free market person, that was Jimmy right from the get-go.
Well, he went to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was fertile ground for him because a guy with he's very charming. I mean, he's but he's not in a selfish, not in a like I'm out for myself, but like, hey, it's a great world. You help me, I help you. We're friends. We've all been to Jimmy's house, or you and I have for dinner, and he's just such a generous person. But his father had left earlier and gone to Hong Kong, and they had a troubled relationship. But I don't want to over-psychologize, but he did make very, very good relationships with older men who helped him out. So he met a retired accountant from his glove factory. The guy would come in a few days a week. He spoke English. Jimmy saw that people who spoke English got ahead. So this guy started teaching him English. And Jimmy spent the nights, he's told me, like reading the dictionary to learn English. And so he was a hustler, but Hong Kong made it possible for people like him to thrive. In China, maybe he'd be dead or in jail. And then in Hong Kong, he could work. I mean, for him, freedom first was just the freedom to eat. He describes waking up the first morning he was in Hong Kong, smelling rice. I mean, anybody who's been to Hong Kong, that kind of warm, congee, smell in the morning of the dai pai dongs. So first it was just the freedom to eat and freedom to work and be paid. And then, of course, the freedom to start his own business and thrive that way.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he was an incredible businessman, I mean, as you described. But then we come across Tiananmen Square. And what's interesting, both in the United States and elsewhere, and in Hong Kong, the degree to which, how quickly businessmen, bankers, and others put Tiananmen Square aside. Jimmy didn't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, interestingly, so from 1989, the Tiananmen killings, until early 1992, when Deng Xiaoping made his famous trip to the South and kind of restarted economic reforms, things were, pretty squishy. But after 92, when Deng and the Chinese, the CCP, turned on the economy and let the entrepreneurial energies of over 1 billion Chinese loose, you're right, bankers and others kind of forgot about the human rights abuses. Jimmy didn't forget about them, but he was optimistic that China could change. I mean, one of the people who's known him since the 70s from the garment business said, an American, Bob Ashkenazi, said he was almost like a Zionist. He was so enamored of Deng's economic reforms, and he believed that economic reform would inevitably lead to political reform. He wanted to do his bit, so he didn't forget by any means, but he also was brave enough to keep calling those out and to try to take advantage of the entrepreneurial, the economic opportunities that a changing China provided. So Giordano set up in Beijing very early on, which of course made him vulnerable, and the Chinese decided they wanted to punish him.
Yeah. No, but that instinct that somehow China could become democratic, how does that fit in with his move to Taipei and setting up Apple Daily and Next Magazine in Taiwan?
Yeah. So first he set up Next magazine in Hong Kong, 1990, just 9 months after Tiananmen. Then he sets up Apple Daily in 1995, so 2 years before the handover. And then in March 2000, Chen Shui-bian was elected as the first Democratic or non-KMT president of Taiwan. And Jimmy says, I want to, I'm Taiwan. I want to move to Taiwan. Taiwan's the future. He really, really thought that what was happening in Taiwan was presaging what would inevitably happen in the mainland. So he moved to Taiwan, moved the whole family there, set up, again, as in Hong Kong. First he sets up Next magazine, then he sets up Taiwan Apple Daily, and he was very forthright that this was going to be a springboard to the mainland, that it was just a matter of time and not too many years before Taiwan would be a springboard to an open free media in the mainland, and Apple Daily was going to be there. And
But I think, at least in conversation with Jimmy, he was so taken with the possibility that, well, the counter argument that the people that somehow, like Sam Huntington and others, that Chinese culture wouldn't allow for a democratic process. And here you had in Taiwan a Chinese culture. The Taiwanese still think of themselves as Taiwanese, properly so, but Chinese culture, and they produced a democracy.
Yeah, no, it gave the lie to what the Chinese Communist Party was saying, that Chinese people couldn't handle, weren't ready for democracy, and also gave the lie to people like Lee Kuan Yew, who said, Chinese innately want an authoritarian leader. Funny how it's always the leaders who say that. Yeah. And I mean, I think most of you have probably been to Taiwan, and you know what a vibrant, open society, and whatever the problems, it's one where there's freedom. And Jimmy was part of developing that and pushing that along. And yeah, again, he was, I think he is a bit of a romantic. He's a bit of an idealist. He somehow thinks things are going to happen kind of faster than they will. But, of course, a lot of us thought that China would inevitably keep opening up, and we've been early.
Yeah. No, I remember when I happened to be in Taiwan when Next magazine first published, and it was so different than the other publications in Taiwan, which were very staid and usually politically connected, and Next and then Apple Daily were so not politically connected and willing to sort of, pull down the covers on whoever was needed to have the covers pulled down on.
Well, I mean, Jimmy, he's a businessman, and we have to remember, he first went into media because he thought it was a great business opportunity. Actually, he told an early hire, he said, we'll run Next magazine for a few years, then we'll sell it. I mean, who wants to run a magazine anyway? So and it's very interesting how he saw the opportunity. In a way, it was a classic sort of strategy that Warren Buffett might employ. Jimmy had a business that had a moat around it. I mean, Buffett looks for businesses that have moats, a protective moat. And what Jimmy told me, I always remember at that first meeting, he invited me to his house, cooked me lunch, 1993, and he didn't use the word moat, he didn't talk about Warren Buffett, but he said, people in Hong Kong want democracy. The first territory-wide elections had just been held for the Legislative Council, and surprising, overwhelming victory by the pan-Democrats. 6 out of 10 people voted for pro-democracy. And yet Jimmy, one by one, went through all the newspapers and how they were all pulling back, self-censoring because they were worried about the 1997 handover. Jimmy said, I've got something that people want, that an audience that'll pay for this, and nobody else wants to touch it. I've got a protective business. And he saw something similar in Taiwan, where, as you say, there were a handful of publications. They were tied to political parties. None of them wanted to rock the boat. And Jimmy said, I'm gonna give people what they want, whether it's salacious gossip, paparazzi photos, free market economics, no socialist economics. That's about the only thing he censored. You're pretty much a broad church, except for anything that smacked of socialism.
There was this period where, again, sort of Jimmy sort of had the grand vision in the early 2000s, early 2000s. And then there's a kind of a lull where he seemed to have drawn back from, sort of thinking about the future of China, Hong Kong, and the rest. And then you get to 2014, where the authorities in Hong Kong pull the plug on the promised election of the chief executive, And then Jimmy seems to jump back in.
Yeah, it's really interesting how that happened. So, the 90s, he was much more focused on Hong Kong, and then through 2003, I think even he and people around him were surprised at their ability to galvanize public protest in 2003. But most of his energy really went into Taiwan from 2000 until about 2010, maybe a little later. Yeah. He really wanted to get into broadcast media, and he was stymied again and again by the elite in Taiwan, that both business and government, that did not want competition from Jimmy. And he lost a lot of money. I think he just got fundamentally very, very discouraged in a way that people around him say they'd never seen. He'd always had ideas, or if he made a mistake, he'd try to learn from his mistake. But in this case, he didn't think he made a mistake. He found a corrupt system that was stymieing him, a corrupt system in a place that he'd had such high hopes for. And so then in 2014, he really, as I tried to indicate in the slides, he was not intending to take a leading role. I mean, he wanted to be out there and bear witness in solidarity with the students, but he really felt it was time for a new generation. But yes, he was very, very energized.
Yeah. So let's now turn to sort of the broader picture of Hong Kong. So the British signed the agreement, British and the Chinese signed an agreement in 97. There's a series of promises. So can you describe what those promises were and what's happened to those promises?
Yeah. So, go back to 1982, Margaret Thatcher makes the first visit by a serving British Prime Minister to Beijing, fresh off the Falklands War victory, thinks that, she can just hang on to Hong Kong. She offered to the Chinese, look, we'll transfer sovereignty to you, but it's okay if we keep running it. Yeah. Deng Xiaoping literally spat in his spittoon. He was not amused. He said, we're taking this place. We can take it tomorrow. We'd rather negotiate something. So the Brits negotiated, okay agreement. And China promised a lot. It promised that the existing ways, the existing freedoms in Hong Kong would survive for 50 years: own currency, tax, administration, government, common law, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, all the freedoms that we in open societies take for granted. This was further codified with the Basic Law, a sort of mini constitution that China itself wrote and imposed on Hong Kong. And it did promise, as you alluded to, move towards full democracy, which is, think about it, it's not a big deal, honestly. It was electing the city council and electing the mayor, the chief executive and the legislative council. Even those little things proved to be too much for China. And as you said, in 2014, they walked back those promises, and the people of Hong Kong said, enough. It's been almost 2 decades, and you're moving us backwards. What about all these promises? And that's when the students took to the streets, and it was a very different dynamic between the students and Jimmy and Apple Daily, but they were all trying to push Hong Kong forward in terms of freedom.
Yeah. That's one of the things I wanted to get to is it's kind of interesting, Jimmy became a Catholic. The one-time leader of the sort of democratic movement in Hong Kong, Martin Lee, Catholic. Cardinal Zen, of course, was famously promoting democracy in Hong Kong. Is there something about the Catholics in Hong Kong that sort of were front and center?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Hong Kong has many Christians, and they have a particularly important role because the British colonial authorities did not invest much in education. And in fact, even primary school education, even 3 years of primary school education wasn't compulsory until 1971. So the churches, both the Anglican or Protestant churches and Catholic churches, would run the schools with a subvention, with a subsidy from the government. And so many people went through Christian schools. The Catholics had a particularly important role in terms of social issues. Anglicans more closely tied to the colonial government, the Catholic Church willing to push things a little bit more. And so I think there was this strong tradition of social engagement on the part of the church. Jimmy got to know Cardinal Zen early on. So he met Teresa just in July 1989. He met Zen, I think about 2 years later. He didn't convert until 1997, but I mean, his brother-in-law, Teresa's sister, married Young Sum, another Catholic, a member of the Democratic Party. So Catholics, Patton happened to be a Catholic. So Catholics were overrepresented in the democracy movement. As I said, Jimmy didn't convert until 97. And even after that, I think there were people who'd look at some of the material published in Apple Daily, or even Jimmy's dinner table conversations. He wasn't spending a lot of time talking about scripture, but
You're more likely to get a quote from Hayek than
definitely.
than Luke.
But that has changed dramatically, and I mean, very seriously, his Catholic faith has given him a foundation and an anchor in prison, and it's allowed him not only to survive, dare I say thrive, but I think really live with dignity and live as a free man in prison. And he spends his days when he's not in court living the life of you really just describe as a monastic life, not the life of a wild-eyed prophet out in the desert, but the life that a Benedictine monk might live. He doesn't control, of course, when he eats or even when his lights go on, but it's a very regularized life. He has to do forced prison labor. He makes envelopes. He spends a lot of time drawing, as I mentioned before, spends a lot of time reading theology and a lot of time praying. So yeah, I think this and his family, especially Teresa and her love and support, have allowed him, and he and Nathan Sharansky and I talked about this right before I went into prison, have allowed him to live the life of a free man. Sharansky often says, I couldn't decide when I was getting out of prison. In fact, he was in the Soviet Gulag for 9 years. The KGB is the one who's going to decide when I'm physically free, but I can live as a free man, and I think that's what Jimmy is trying to model. Obviously, and he and Sharansky talked about this, very different faiths. Sharansky's Jewish, Jimmy's Catholic. Their wives and their spiritual faith have kept them going.
Yeah, well, it's a theme also you find in Solzhenitsyn's Gulag in in his novels, that inner freedom is possible even in the harshest confining conditions. But speaking of, friends have often wondered why, back in 2019 when things were clearly going south, why Jimmy didn't, get on a plane and leave Hong Kong.
Yeah, a lot of people asked him to leave. They told him to leave, and you think about it, he's a guy who could have just gone to the airport any afternoon and he'd be gone. He's got apartments in London, Paris, house in Kyoto, Taipei. He's a British citizen. But he said, well, he wanted to keep fighting. He was a leader, even though he didn't want political power. But he said that he'd rather be hanging dead from a lamppost in central Hong Kong than to give the Chinese communists the satisfaction of saying that he ran away. He's not a runner. He's a guy who believes in his principles. And if he has to, I'm afraid, I'm sorry, I hope it doesn't come to this, I think he's willing to die for his principles. That's just who he is. You can see how he's been forged. And he's the kind of guy the communists don't come up against very often. First of all, of course, he's wealthy. He's got a lot of resources. He had a media megaphone. He really believes in freedom and democracy, but he also has real principles. And I think the CCP has a hard time with that.
Well, there's not a lot of that. There were a lot of Hong Kong businessmen who somehow accommodated themselves to the changing situation in Hong Kong. So, and Jimmy really is the exception to the rule in a lot of respects, I think. So.
Yeah, he's one in a billion. And I think we talked about turning points. That chocolate bar was one. Another one was in 1994 when he wrote, when Li Peng, who took over as premier in the midst of the chaotic events of the spring of 1989, it was really a coup d'etat, but Li Peng was derided by many people as the butcher of Beijing, and he was making his first visit to the West since the Tiananmen killings 5 years earlier. And Jimmy happened to be in Paris, so it was very much on his mind. Li was in Germany when Jimmy wrote a column, just trashing, excoriating Li Peng. Called him a bastard or son of a turtle egg is the literal translation, and much worse. I mean, it was just really undercutting the Chinese Communist Party. And so in response, the CCP started shutting Giordano stores in Beijing. They found all sorts of licensing violations, et cetera, et cetera. And almost every other businessman would have said, as the Chinese expected, would have said, oh, boy, I better back off here. I want to protect my business. Jimmy's like, I don't care. I mean, I remember I saw him just as this was happening, and he was adamant. So he resigned from Giordano, he sold his shares, and the next month, or actually in September, wrote another column saying, I'm sorry, my language is a little intemperate, but I meant it. This is a corrupt, evil party. Li Peng is a bad guy, this party is bad, and it's going to be consigned to the dust heap of history, more or less. And so at important turns, Jimmy will double down and do the principled thing.
Yeah. Well, he is 76, maybe 77 years old. So if he's going to get out, we need to get him out sooner than later. What's your sense of both the U.S., of course he's a UK citizen. What's your sense of how things are being worked here in Washington and also in London?
Well, first of all, it's way above my pay grade. I run a nonprofit that focuses on Hong Kong freedom in general, on all the political prisoners in Hong Kong, so I don't have any special knowledge. It has been almost 4 years. It was beginning of December, December 3rd, I think 4 years ago, that his bail was denied. He got out for a few days of house arrest over Christmas, but he's been in jail since December 31st, 2020, so over 1,400 days. He had diabetes going in, had COVID while he was in prison. He's had a cataract operation. He's being held in solitary with no sunlight. So he's, as you say, it's got to happen sooner rather than later. When the contract for my book was signed 2 years ago, I figured that, the book is coming out. I knew it would come out now. It's being published tomorrow. I figured that the trial would have been over for a year, that they would have, convicted him, thrown away the key. Maybe I could shine a bit of spotlight on this, half-forgotten political prisoner. And so I'm stunned that the trial is still going on. We just today had the 100th day of the trial, and I'm not sure when it's going to be over. So first thing we need to do is finish this trial. At the rate things are going, we won't have we expect a conviction. There's almost 100% conviction rate. Yeah. This law, national security law, was pretty much written to convict Jimmy, although really just convicting him for practicing journalism. So we've got to get a conviction, or we have to have a resolution, a verdict, and then I think that, we're kind of getting to the end of the beginning. President-elect Trump has promised that he will get Jimmy released. He says 100%. He says it'll happen quickly. I hope he's right. I'm delighted to hear his commitment to getting Jimmy out. Very pleased to hear that UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer brought the issue up on camera with Xi Jinping during the recent G20 meeting. So I think we're starting to see some movement, and it's got to happen at the top level. It has to happen. Xi Jinping and the US president, and maybe to some degree the UK, have to be involved. I would remind the Chinese that there's probably nothing that has a lower cost and potential higher benefit than releasing Jimmy and some of the other political prisoners in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
I mean, they've made their point. Apple Daily's presses are not going to be running again.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's striking, though, that the trial, it's as though they're waiting from Beijing to hear what should be done before they finish the trial, which is kind of interesting, which perhaps means that Xi himself is not certain what he wants out of this. So besides shutting down,
Yeah. I think they've made their point with Hong Kong. I would say, let's not give up on Hong Kong. Let's not forget there are more than 7 million people there. 6 out of 10 from that first election in 1991 until the last free election at the end of 2019. More or less, 6 out of 10 people have always voted for the pro-democracy candidates. Certainly the people of Hong Kong want freedom. They want better than what they have. But is Jimmy Lai a threat to CCP rule? No. He's a guy that would like to spend his last years with his family.
Yeah, yeah. So let's turn to questions. If you'll identify yourself and wait for the mic, and also just make sure it's a question. No, you can make a statement too. What the heck? So please, right here.
Hi, I'm Lisa Hannett from Booz Allen Hamilton. Thanks so much for the book. My question is, I'm assuming Jimmy Lai must have faced that there was some other political prisoner in China in some time in his life that he wanted to help get out, I'm guessing. What was his playbook? Like, do you know, like, Jimmy Lai's playbook for what the US and the UK should be doing to get him out?
Those are interesting. I don't know that there was a particular political prisoner that he tried to get out. He did go when Liu Xiaobo got the Nobel Peace Prize, and of course Liu ended up dying in Chinese custody. Jimmy went to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony where there was famously an empty chair on the stage. So I think Jimmy wants to be part of the tradition, the Chinese dissident tradition. I don't think he was actively working to get people out. I'm not absolutely certain, but he was peripherally involved with Operation Yellowbird, which was getting dissidents out after the Tiananmen killings. He helped people, actually, interestingly, Wang Dan, Wu Kai-shi, and Chai Ling, who were featured on the T-shirts, that I showed, he ended up helping them after they got out. But I don't think he really had a playbook to get people out. He's been very generous in his financial support for a variety of causes, including individual dissidents. But I don't know if that can be more specific. But he likes supporting people. He wants to be part of that tradition, and he was willing to, write checks to support that.
My apologies. Those watching online, you also can submit questions if you want. I think if you look at the website for the event, you'll be able to see the John Roach's email address, and you just email him your question, and we'll try to add it into the list. So, another question, please. Please, here.
Hello. I am the wife of the political prisoner in China, Ding Jiaxi. I always curious about the trial because right now in China, every trial are closed the door. How's the trial of Jimmy? Is the media people can go to the court and can publish the court process or not?
Yeah, well, thanks. And first of all, nice to see you, and my thoughts are to you and your family. I know you've suffered for many, many years. It's a great question. Right after the national security law came into effect, when the pro-Beijing people wanted to say how it wasn't going to really affect Hong Kong, there was a statement, I believe in China Daily, but it was an official authoritative statement that said that defendants under the national security law have the freedom to be convicted in open court, not like tried, convicted, but open court. But it is important because in China, I think it's the case with your husband and many other Chinese, the court completely closed. Even foreign citizens are not always able to get consular access at the trials. That was the case with the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, when they were tried on sham, when they were held hostage. In Hong Kong, it's still open to the media. We're not able to get any photos. It's very interesting. That photo that I showed that was taken almost a year and a half ago now is the last photo we've seen of Jimmy. So no photography no images in the court. But we are getting reports from international news agencies, and Hong Kong press is also there. So I guess we should be grateful for small things. Of course, the basic law provided the right to trial by jury. National security law has eviscerated that. Provides for the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. The three hand-picked national security law judges in this case have been acting almost like prosecutors. So, it's better than the mainland, but it's pretty bad, and it's nowhere near what China promised, let alone what it was during the British period. So, I don't know, kind of a mixed picture.
Look, you just reminded me, I wanted to ask you about, when the handover to China happened in '97, the expectation was that it was in China's interest to have a kind of open and free Hong Kong for all kinds of reasons, some of them principally economic and the like. But obviously that changed after 2012 when Xi came into power. What's the dynamic? Why was he willing to sort of pass on that one kind of interest and move to sort of completely overturn this sort of independent system, autonomy?
You know, it's a great question. I think scholars and all of us are going to be trying to figure this out. I mean, it seems so self-defeating. It seems to me that China is shooting itself in the foot. Okay, let's say, worst case scenario from China's standpoint, that there were universal suffrage and, I don't know, a pro-independence student leader were elected mayor. So what? Is this really a threat to China? And by the way, that wasn't going to happen. But from China's standpoint, even somebody like Martin Li or Anson Chan, who had been chief secretary under Patton and then under Teng Chee-hwa, were seen as some kind of an existential threat. So either things are a lot more perilous in Beijing and for Beijing's rule than we know, or they're they're unduly paranoid. I just do not see.
Could be both.
It could be both. I mean, yes, things got a bit out of control in 2019, to put it mildly, but let's look at why. 20 years of lying and backpedaling by Beijing, coupled with intense police violence and no negotiations with any student leader. There's not even a pretense of a meeting with any of the leaders or any of the activists. I think Beijing just brought this dynamic on itself. I think the other thing scholars will try to figure out is, was this Xi Jinping or was the CCP inevitably going to have a strong authoritarian, totalitarian leader or face the possibility of sclerosis, corruption, and eventual collapse? And they chose a totalitarian, and this is what we've got.
Yeah, I think by 2011 and 12, there was a sense that they'd run out the game when it came to economic performance, and that there was a kind of a Ponzi scheme that eventually wasn't going to keep producing the kinds of economic growth. And if there wasn't economic growth, what was the point of the party if it wasn't providing the whole, sort of growth model?
Yeah, I think it was in 2007, the premier himself, the number 2 guy in China, Wen Jiabao, said, I think it was unstable, uncoordinated, and unbalanced, or something like that, describing the economy. Things and now we've seen, of course, they've gone this much further, and the lack of a free press meant that, the Ponzi scheme, typified by the real estate market, collapsed under its own weight.
Hi, Mark. Can you speak to Jimmy's...
Could you identify yourself?
Sorry, April Panuru with Ridgely Walsh. Can you speak to Jimmy's citizenship and sort of how the Chinese government views that, and also whether he has consular access?
Yeah. Well, thanks. As I said, the last time he had Chinese papers was in 1961 when he had a one-way permit to Macau. Ever since then, he came to Hong Kong, got British colonial papers, got full British citizenship in 1992, has never traveled on Chinese papers, and yet the Chinese, in what I would say is a very racist approach to citizenship, say that because he's born in China, he's always Chinese, and therefore they regard him as a dual national, even though it has no basis in international law. And as a result, they deny consular access to to Jimmy by UK diplomats. It's completely unsupportable legally. I wish the Brits would push a bit harder to get consular access. It's been 4 years, and I think that would help. On the British and the legal question, I should mention that the Basic Law also gives all defendants the right to choose their own counsel. In Hong Kong, that has extended to include international counsel. In Jimmy's case, that was denied. The whole legal system was kind of twisted into a pretzel to change the rules so that Jimmy could not get an overseas lawyer. He wanted to hire Tim Owen, a King's Counsel. I think it would have been great to have an international lawyer robustly making the case for Jimmy. It's not to take anything away from his local counsel, but they live in Hong Kong. They're subject to the same pressures as the other 7 million Hong Kong people. So I think in many cases, the Chinese are disregarding international law and their own rules to deny Jimmy consular access, deny him his lawyer. Tim Owen was based in the UK.
Back here.
Suzanne Smolik. Just to play devil's advocate, if she started demanding from President Biden that he release the January 6 detainees, would that be appropriate?
That diplomacy is about, if I don't know if they wanted to go to, the way these things usually happen is people are released and go to another country. And I think Xi Jinping can ask President Trump anything he wants.
Please, right here.
I'm Kevin Killian. China has the National Security Act, and the United States is using the Espionage Act against journalists. And could Biden set an example in pardoning a couple of people, like President Obama did? He said he could pardon Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden, but not both. I don't know why. But could they set an example and stop using the Espionage Act against journalists and maybe pardon Julian Assange, because his plea bargain leaves U.S. journalists at risk of being charged with the Espionage Act?
Yeah, it sounds like you're much more knowledgeable about this than I am, so I can't really say. Obviously, President Biden on his way out is as many presidents do, is pardoning people. So I guess we need to stay tuned for the next 6 weeks.
Yeah. I think we're going to close conversation, but before I do, I just want to remind folks that there'll be book signing here, and the books are free. So please join us for after that. But I want to close by reading a wonderful line or two from Mark's introduction of the book. This is a quote: "History is littered with examples of single individuals posing earth-shaking threats to totalitarian regimes. Oddly, it is precisely at those moments when dictatorships are wielding their most repressive power that these stubborn personalities prove most vexatious." I can't imagine a better description of Jimmy than that one. So please join me, and thank you, Mark, both for the biography and also for joining us today.